Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Nine Sports Podcast. I'm Howard Medgal.
And I'm Jackie Powell.
And we are delighted to be with you talking about Chris DeMarco, new head coach of the New York Liberty. We're in the room where it happened. Well, in the room where they talked about how it happened. Jackie Powell there at the press conference. We are excited to get into all of what it means and why this person at this time. Plus, later on in the show, who should we worry about more, Duke or South Carolina? Interesting, right? We'll debate it. We'll knock it around. But first, really important, number one at the nine, it is top story of the week. It is Chris DeMarco. Why is it Chris DeMarco? Jackie Powell, we're going to put 60 seconds on the clock. Tell our listeners why Chris DeMarco. And go.
So the New York Liberty officially introduced their 10th head coach in franchise history in Chris DeMarco, a 14-year NBA veteran who worked his way up through the Golden State Warriors organization from a scout to a video coordinator, a player development coach, and then to a front bench assistant coach. And so why did he get this job? I mean, the Golden State Warriors are a modern NBA dynasty, and the Liberty want to be a modern WNBA dynasty. And he has experience trying to reach those heights. And so on today's show, we're going to share with you what Howard and I made of what DeMarco and Jonathan Kolb had to say during his press conference.
4 seconds to spare. Very impressive. So let's just start at the very top. And I think the most interesting thing that I took away from this was the way Jonathan Kolb expressed that this was not a rush, and it never needed to be and shouldn't have been. It was about finding the right person. And then I'm watching the two of them sitting together, and you could see the way in which the teamwork operated. And I wrote about this a little bit over at the Nine Daily, but I am interested in just sort of your initial in-person impressions of the duo, the dynamic between the two.
Well, it seemed to me that they are on the same page when it comes to the type of basketball that wants to be played. I think that was very clear to me. But also in just sort of listening to how they spoke, it seemed clear that Chris DeMarco is of similar ilk to Jonathan Kolb in that they work really hard. They prefer being behind the scenes. They're not always the most, how do I put it, charismatic on camera, and that's okay. And I think that showed as to why they were such a good match. You know, their energies sort of matched one another. Does that make sense?
It does. And, you know, there's a couple of elements of that. I tend to prefer the people who are doing the work to the people who are performative online in basically every walk of life, our own industry included. And so from that perspective, hearing him talk about both with humility and an ability to bring to the table some real accomplishments across basketball was very significant to me, that this is somebody who comes in both prepared, knowing quite a bit, along with being willing to do the work. Now, we'll talk about, and we'll get into more about why the work that he has to do is in a lot of ways different from some of the hires that we have seen in the WNBA in past years. There's a different emphasis, and with that different emphasis comes different challenges. To try and get up to speed on the WNBA is not something necessarily that somebody who worked in the WNBA already would have to do. But again, where does that sort of duality come together? There is a clear where Chris DeMarco stops, where Jonathan Kolb begins. There is a clear Chris DeMarco is in charge of all things relating to the coaching of the team, and Jonathan Kolb is the general manager of this team. And I say that very specifically because, and I wrote about this yesterday, Sandy Brondello, if you have a Sandy Brondello in your organization, you would be crazy not to ask her about player personnel moves along the way. And Sandy Brondello, with her pedigree, what she has done in this game and knows the league, certainly has her opinions about how it ought to work. This is a different thing. This is also a model that's far closer to the NBA model in terms of where that disconnect is. And so
I think it's also worth understanding when it came to Sandy. She sort of had to deal with, I'll call it whiplash, because in her previous job, before the Liberty job in Phoenix, technically her general manager was Jim Pittman. And this was someone who not only wore the hat of being general manager of the Phoenix Mercury, but he also, I believe, was working on the business side for the Phoenix Suns.
Mm-hmm.
And often what would happen is he would get pulled in the direction of the Phoenix Suns, and Sandy would sort of be there to her own devices to make a lot of the player personnel decisions, because she was working with a less involved, too far stretched out executive that was mostly hired to do things on the men's side.
Well, but can we talk about that for a minute? Like, that has been the model in the WNBA forever. We're in this watershed moment where the WNBA, and it's only been the last few years, is finally at a point where jobs that should be one job in their entirety are somehow turned into one of like 3 things you're being asked to do, 4 things you're being asked to do. In Jim Pittman's case, for instance, the men's side stuff took priority.
Yep.
Like it or not, that was he may not like to hear it described in that way, but we both had enough conversations with folks who experienced it to know that was the reality. And so now the WNBA has gotten to a point where many of the teams are prioritizing, general manager or, head of basketball operations is its own thing. Coach is its own thing. And by the way, coach is not its own thing. And maybe you got an assistant or two who one of them might leave during the year just to go do something else. And no one even announces it. You've got a full bench. You've got player development folks. You've got video. You've got analytics, not everywhere, but most places. And so as a result of that, teams are now getting to reimagine how they can prioritize and how they can divide and conquer. And that doesn't therefore mean that the teams are dividing and conquering in a way that will be successful. There's going to be some pluses that go with that and some minuses that go with that. And people are going to get it wrong. And by the way, by definition, if championship or bust is the mentality, which we'll talk about a little later on, if that is the mentality, every team but one is going to get it wrong every single year. So you put all that together and it makes sense that the Liberty are trying for a different model in, quite frankly, much the same way it made sense to bring in a steady hand like Sandy Brondello as the successor to Walt Hopkins.
Yeah, it's interesting that we start talking about the different hires that Jonathan Kolb has made, because I recently wrote a story that you can read at the9basketball.com, sort of my sights and sounds from what yesterday looked like. And I even, like the New York Liberty sicko I am, I went back and I looked at both press conferences. I looked at the Sandy press conference, which, by the way, was done on Zoom. She never had her face and image and likeness on the Jumbotron and whatnot, because we were still in lockdown. And then I went back to before we even knew the word COVID-19 to 2020, where Walt Hopkins did his press conference. And the reason I bring this up is because yes, DeMarco is another white man, but he is very different from Walt Hopkins. So sure, he does not have the charisma and the personality that Sandy would bring to every press conference that she did. And that's okay. But at the same time, Chris DeMarco is someone who has legitimate head coaching experience.
Yeah.
Someone who brought the Bahamas men's national team from ground zero to almost the Olympics and had to win 10 games in a row, which without a lot of resources to do so.
Can I just speak to this point? Because you said something to me that has been floating in my head ever since. There is a lot of conversation, and rightly so, about the fact that we have seen fewer women hired, fewer women of color hired this time around.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, and this was not what you said, I'll get to that in a minute, but we know you can hire white men and do well, and you can hire women of color and not do well, and vice versa. It's about the individual hire. You know, people had questions about Nate Tibbetts, but it's really hard to question what Nate Tibbetts has accomplished so far as a head coach. People were very excited, especially in New York, to see Teresa Weatherspoon get a head coaching opportunity. And that did not work out in Chicago, to put it mildly. And so I say all that to say the way in which I always try to think of this isn't, well, is a box being checked in this one hire, but rather, what do the systems look like that are producing this? And so what we were talking about earlier on is the fact that WNBA teams who are now looking to add more experience and expand the pool, and in many ways can expand the pool because teams are devoting more resources to it, are saying NBA is a place where we can find some folks to look at things differently, who have worked with maybe some more advanced models and doing it that way. Well, as you pointed out, and this is the part where this comes in, the NBA, and I remember writing about it when Christy Tolliver was one of the first hires, who, while she was still playing in the WNBA, to be an assistant coach, made $10,000, by the way, because of a quirk/limitation in the what will ultimately be 2 CBAs ago, CBA. However, what we have not seen, despite the fact that she's done such great work, despite the fact that Sue Bird did great work doing this, despite the fact that Becky Hammon was an integral part. I mean, you know, the people who have succeeded in big ways as WNBA to NBA assistant pathway. We've seen the pathway in a lot of ways dry up. And if we are in a moment where NBA assistants are going to be a primary source of future WNBA head coaches, that is a problem if we are not seeing diversity reflected in who the NBA is hiring as their assistants. I don't know what you do about it, but I think it's worth pointing out that this is a significant issue, almost in a ricochet effect rather than directly.
So I think I know what you do about it. And there is a story that I continue to go back to. And ESPNW published this 5 years ago. It's by Charlotte Gibson, and it's entitled Trailblazing NBA Women Coaches. And the deck reads, and for those of you who are not journalism nerds, the deck is essentially the subheadline: about a third of NBA teams now employ a woman coach. Here, the coaches discuss their ascension in the men's league. Mm-hmm. So that number in 2020, 5 years ago, was maybe around 10 or 11 on coaching benches. That number now is at most 4, maybe 3. And so, you know, I think there is some onus on the NBA to step up and continue to hire women. And I think it's very interesting to take a look at the timelines because there was this high right around 2020.
Yeah.
And now here we are in 2025 and we're at a low. The WNBA has their own type of high and low like that as well. So if we remember back in 2020, the WNBA instituted this rule expanding their coach bench. They said, okay, you can have 3 coaches in addition to your head coach, but one coach amongst the 4 has to be a former player.
Mm-hmm.
That new rule brought in, it really jump-started the pipeline. And so in 2022 was when we started to see more women than men as head coaches in the WNBA. In 2026, it will be the first year since 2021 where more men will be head coaches in the WNBA than women. And
Let's
so,
just to be clear, by the way, when I say I don't know what we do about it, I mean you and me, since we don't run the NBA. It's very clear what the NBA ought to do about it, which
right.
is to hire more women. There are so many women available who are now coming with WNBA assistant head coaching experience too. But in the same way that the WNBA, it's interesting, right? The idea was that if you have these players on WNBA benches, the primary place where WNBA head coaches came from at that time was WNBA assistants. And that changed over the last 2 hiring periods, especially this past offseason that we've seen. We're not seeing those players turn coaches getting opportunities now in the NBA or in the WNBA. I talked to multiple former players who are now assistant coaches, didn't even get calls, weren't even in the interviews for these openings this time around. So teams are making a different decision. And again, teams at the end of the day are going to try and make the decision that best reflects their ability to win. On each individual basis, you can make a sound argument for one person or another. But if we don't think about those systems, I mean, how many times do we talk about it in women's sports writ large? It's always, you have to look at the inputs rather than the outcomes. If you're focused on the outcomes, you're missing what needs to change in order for it to happen. So I'm glad you raised it. It is a fascinating thing. And by the way, it's a thing we're going to continue to come back to. But I do want to get to the specifics here and to talk about the challenges specifically for Chris DeMarco. So as you think about the New York Liberty, I know I have my own thoughts about this as well, but what is, in your mind, the biggest set of challenges for Chris DeMarco here as head coach of the New York Liberty right away?
Well, I think there are a couple. I think maybe we can start with, this idea, and I know it was essentially the lead in your Basketball Wednesday. When you ask him to define success, that is a pretty tall order. And so I asked him at a scrum. It was at this basketball clinic for young girls at the Brooklyn Basketball Practice Center. And before I introduce this clip, I do want to say Chris DeMarco looked so at home at this clinic, much more so than sitting up on the podium talking to us, which makes sense because he's mostly been an assistant throughout his career.
That's also what you want. You don't need a guy to win the press conference. You need a guy to win the games consistently.
Right. And so what he looked most at home doing was talking to the head of the Liberty's community programs, Ali Mogan. What he loved doing was bonding with Sabrina Ionescu. He loved talking to the kids and looking at the signs and posters that they made for him. And he was very taken aback by it because this is a guy who clearly has not experienced many situations where, he's being honored. So it was really fascinating to observe. But anyway, this is what Chris DeMarco said about what defines success in 2026 and beyond. So take a listen.
In 2026, we obviously have championship aspirations, and the roster's built as such, and I touched on it earlier, it's championship pedigree, so that's always going to be the goal. It's also about developing players, building the right culture, making sure we're competitive every game.
What's interesting as we listen to Chris DeMarco, and clearly what he has promised and what the New York Liberty are expecting is a championship or bust mentality. And I wrote about this over at the 9 Daily. I don't think that's fair to him. I don't think that's fair to Jonathan Kolb. I don't think that is a reasonable standard for any team to take on. You know, I'll just give you as an example the Minnesota Lynx, who won in 2011, 2013, 2015, and 2017. Are we to say that when they were knocked out in the semis in 2014, that it was time for a change? Are we to say that in 2016, when they lost by a point in Game 5, that was an unsuccessful season? And moreover, when there was a gap in even reaching the finals from 2017 through 2024, should Minnesota have made a change? Clearly not. When you have somebody who is seasoned, who is exceptional at work, who will someday be in Naismith, as well as Knoxville, in Cheryl Reeve, you don't make that change. But when you set up that championship or bust mentality, and I talked about this in the piece, if they don't win next year, and that's year one for a new head coach with a learning curve in Chris DeMarco, who I'm impressed by, and who, to be frank, if Jonathan Kolb is impressed by, I am impressed by, because this is somebody who has put together teams that went 91-33 over the last 3 years with a WNBA finals appearance and a championship under his belt.
Two WNBA finals appearances.
No, I'm saying, right. One finals, one outright championship. Right. Very, very good point. 2 finals in 3 years is probably
and a Commissioner's Cup championship too.
And a Commissioner's Cup championship. I mean, I just sit there and think, if this New York Liberty team finishes 4th next year in the regular season and loses in the semifinals, is that going to be an unsuccessful season in some way? And more to the point, Jonathan Kolb, who's now got 6 years of experience, it'll be 7 next year as general manager, is that a reason to make a change, to move on? And I'm framing it that way, not because I know for a fact that New York is framing it that way, but we know how professional sports works. And more to the point, we know how professional sports works in the WNBA now in a way that it didn't for a long time, in ways that were damaging in its own right, that failure was tolerated in a lot of corners of this league, and it's not anymore. And that's great. That is great. But there is a question, and I've said it on the first show, I'll probably say it everyone, we live in the gray area, here of trying to determine, well, exactly how much of an emphasis should it be? And so I guess I would argue teams should be looking to reach excellence. A championship should be the aspiration. It should not be the only bar that matters to measure success in a given year. I'm not sure that's where New York is, and I'm fascinated to find out where they will be.
I don't want to go on too long of a tangent, but I think the thing I want to bring up is that the Liberty and the Las Vegas Aces have been on this interesting collision course in the past 5 years, and I mean, or maybe 6 years. It even started when Bill Laimbeer was still leading the Aces, and Katie Smith got pissed that she didn't get the #1 pick, but Bill got it instead. But I bring this up to say the Las Vegas Aces, 3 championships, that is a dynasty. And I just remember it was Clara Wu Tsai, the owner of the New York Liberty, who has said multiple times that she wants a dynasty. And so the fact that the Las Vegas Aces have achieved this first and before the Liberty, and the Liberty they're very much so chasing that.
Yeah.
But also, mind you, the Liberty had to do this in a very different way than the Aces did. The Aces had 3 number 1 picks in a row.
Yep.
In a row. The Liberty had 1 number 1 pick, and then Jonathan Kolb, he got the talent from free agency and from building a culture in New York that wasn't prevalent across the WNBA.
A number 1 pick whose injuries limited her ability in years 1 and especially 2 to be the player that we now know Sabrina Ionescu is. So it is really interesting. End of the day, this is the operatic high drama of professional sports. That's what the New York Liberty are. Thank goodness we have. I mean, what you called yourself, New York Liberty sicko, obsessive? What did you call? Because you're a New York Liberty beat reporter doing it the right way, which is to say that you're going to bring your dramatic background to being able to talk about this team. And thank goodness, because it is high comedy, high drama, you name it. It is going to be absolutely fascinating. And so we will have so much more. Just give me your final thoughts on it, and then I want to get to our court vision before we go.
Yes. So I think my final thought on this is something else that Chris DeMarco, or something else that I asked Chris DeMarco. And so, Howard, you and I, we talked about the gender piece, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I posed this question to Chris DeMarco. I said to him, how committed are you to surrounding yourself and having your full front bench consist of women?
But this question about hiring women, Chris DeMarco, this was his answer. And Jackie, I'm really curious what you made of it, because I had certain my own thoughts about it. I've always had women on my staff. I have worked with women my entire NBA and career and international career. When I was a head coach of the Bahamas national team, I hired Coach Yo as our associate head coach. I think it was in 21, the Mississippi women's head coach in 22, to really presently Addison Walters. She's an assistant coach now for the G League's Iowa Wolves, has always been in my staff. So I've always just tried to identify the right people for the culture I'm trying to build and the best basketball coaches. What does that sound like to you?
To me, that sounds like he is going to surround himself with women. It won't necessarily be all women.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if it is, that would be fantastic. But it sounds like he is going to do his due diligence. And I guess the one concern I have is I think there's going to be a need to hire someone who has WNBA institutional knowledge. And so maybe it could be the type of thing where you have 2 women that come from the G League, and then you have a man that has been within WNBA circles for a very long time. That's a situation I could see. Or maybe
just going to say, the more cross-pollination there is, by the way, the easier this is for everyone to use the wisdom and experience of all of these leagues.
For sure. And, I was even thinking about former players. I was trying to think, who are some recently retired WNBA players who know this league and they understand institutionally how this is different than the NBA?
Man, I would call Kia Vaughn. I would call her yesterday. I know she's already got a job. I'm just saying. Anyway, totally agree with you. And I would just add this. The thing that I took away from it that I felt good about, that made it feel to me like this is somebody who's thinking about this in the right way, instead of like binders full of women, the way Mitt Romney put it. Pretty simple. Diversity requires intentionality. And I think Chris DeMarco brings that to everything he does. Proof will be in the pudding, but it'll be really interesting to see.
For sure. Now, moving on to our court vision. So as we identified in our first show, we are going to have a forward-thinking final segment. And so, we're looking toward the future. And so, Howard, I must ask you, amid what we've seen in women's college basketball as of late, who should we worry about more? The Duke Blue Devils or the South Carolina Gamecocks?
And I will say, to our credit at the Nine Basketball, we have written about the travails of both. Martin Heinzelman, our ACC reporter, wrote about Duke's struggles. Stephanie Killoy caught up with Dawn Staley and wrote about South Carolina's struggles. These are on different planes, in my view. The South Carolina Gamecocks relied heavily on the bench last year. They averaged 40 a game off the bench. They had 2 points off the bench in their 66-64 loss to Texas. I didn't even know Dawn Staley was allowed to lose to Vic Schaefer, but apparently that can happen. And then I shouldn't even say that. I was at Mississippi State when Mississippi State finally beat South Carolina at the hump. But anyway, sorry, shout out to Vic. But where is Duke? Where is Duke? Duke is 4-6. Duke is not just averaging 69 points per game, 92.5 points per 100 possessions, which is the number I really care about, which is 182nd in the NCAA. Not a championship number, not even an NCAA tournament number. But you say, well, Carol Lawson teams, they make their money on the other end. They are allowing 88.5 points per 100 possessions. That's 189th. The Duke defense wishes it could be performing like the Duke offense right now. And so there are some real concerns there, Jackie Powell.
So I agree with you. I think when it comes to explaining South Carolina's struggles, I think what it comes down to is the fact that the person that their offense is built around, or their number one option, is Tania Latson. And she's brand new to the Dawn Staley experience and to how things are supposed to go. She's scoring a lot of points, but still, when you have such a focus of your offense being so new, I think that's sort of what is leading to some of this confusion. And, I think about UConn, who has been absolutely dominant this year, not complacent at all. I mean, you think about who their number one and their number two are in Sarah Strong and AZ Fudd. Those are the two people the offense is built around. They know Gino Auriemma. They're not new to how he does things. And so I think that's part of South Carolina's struggles. I think they are trying to learn this new piece, and Tania Latson is trying to learn them.
I do have to add, again, these are first world problems. They're 9-1. Their only loss is to Texas by 2 points. I think Texas is a Final Four team. So these are the type of problems that 355 to 360 Division I coaches would sign up for. And it's also worth noting, I agree with everything you just said about Tania Latson, who I will continue to say, and I've said this since she was a freshman, is the best pro prospect in any draft she comes out into of all the domestic players, of all the NCAA players. I think Tania Latson is that level of impact player at the WNBA level down the line. But as part of the learning curve, poor Tania Latson, she's only shooting at an effective field goal rate of 59.4%. The struggles. Tania Latson, 1.14 points per possession as she's learning the new system. What are they going to do? Tania Latson's only hitting 54.2% of her threes. Oh, no. Poor South Carolina. I mean, and they're going to get better. And she's going to get better. Holy cow.
Yes. And there's time for that bench to develop. And I guess I don't know if it's fair to compare what their bench was last year to what it is this year. So I think we're on the same page here. But anyway, that is our court vision, and that is it for us. This has been Jackie Powell and
Howard Medgal.
And we are signing off. Have a wonderful weekend, and we will see you back here next Friday.